and all the other things that happened in 2020, but we've actually been really grateful for it. It's really been a wonderful chance to engage with existing members of the Barn Alliance, but also extend our outreach. And as I mentioned a moment ago, all of our lectures are posted onto our YouTube channel. You can go and search just Barn Alliance. You can subscribe or even just follow the recommendations that are also linked to. I've been looking at a lot of the things that are popping up once you discover some more barn videos. So good stuff is out there, good things are happening, and we're happy to have you here with us tonight. John Adamson is our guest lecturer this evening. I first met John. Hi, sorry, I'm Danae Peckler. I am the current president of the National Barn Alliance. For anyone who's been around for a while, you've probably, you're familiar with me. I've been on the board since 2010. And I've been president before, but I was happy to come back into this role. And I'm very pleased tonight to introduce John. I first got to meet John, actually. He was my go-to guy for the 2016 National Barn Alliance Barn Tour that we organized when we were having a partnered annual conference in association with the Preservation Trades Network, or what they call their IPTW, their International Preservation Trades Workshop at Berryville, Virginia, which is just north of Belle Grove Plantation, where John is on the board, and Shenandoah County. And John was the best local connection I could have ever made. All of a sudden, he helped me find great barn owners who are very interested in sharing the amazing historic barns that they have in Shenandoah County. And so I think it was really good fortune that our paths crossed. And since that time, you may have also noticed, if you're a Barn Alliance member, John's one of our most prolific contributors to the barn door. His recent survey work has led him to a number of discoveries that he's been kind enough to share with us. And so therefore, it gives me great pleasure to introduce him tonight so that he can enlighten us all on the very vast number of barns in this county that he has examined and learned from. And I know we're all going to enjoy what he calls a photo essay, but I guarantee you it will be a lot more than that, of his close inspection of Shenandoah County barns in Virginia. So without further ado, John, I will let you get things rolling.
Oh, thanks very much, Danae. Welcome, everybody. It's fun to see so many folks from wherever you all are. I'm going to talk about barns in the county where I live, and I'm going to get to that real quickly. I've got a lot of pictures. I hope to move quickly, and we're going to use the chat feature. If you have questions, please. And Michael or Danae, if you see something that's worthy of having me stop, I'm happy to do that. Otherwise, we'll wait to the end and let's get going. I hope everybody can see this just fine. Here we go, a nice snowy picture of a Shenandoah County barn. Oh, it won't advance. I'm trying to advance my image and the little arrow doesn't seem to do anything. That's not a good start.
Oh no, a delay. Thank you for, I will say, John, for saying something about the questions. Yes, if anyone has them, we will certainly be watching. I'll be watching the chat, and I will kind of log questions as things move along. So we can keep track, and we'll certainly do what we can to. Here we go.
Better. Okay. I am from on the board of the Shenandoah County Historical Society, so we have to have a little history to get going. Those of you who don't know Shenandoah County, hopefully you know Virginia, you see where we are within the county, and a few sort of factoids about Shenandoah County pertinent to the conversation tonight. It's an agricultural county, still is, fairly rural, though it's only about 75 miles west of Washington, D.C. If we look at it at the county a little closer, just a few data points. We're going to be talking about grain harvest because grain agriculture is really important to the story of the barns here. The map of the county you see on the screen shows the prime farmlands, and the white areas are the mountains. The ones to the east are the Blue Ridge and an arm of the Blue Ridge called Massanutten Mountain, and to the left or west are the Alleghenies. The fertile valley in between is where the prime farmland is. And the little black dots represent grist mills identified on an 1885 map of the county to give you some idea of the extent and intensive grain agriculture here in that period. And that's sort of what we're going to be looking at. But first, let's take a little tour of agriculture 100 or so years ago. Shenandoah County has a great archive of photos, and I want to share those a little to set the scene because frankly, the barns we're going to see were the barns that were built and working in the period of these photos depict. Beautiful bucolic farm scene, an early automobile, dirt roads in the background, a farmstead, and a 4-bay bank barn visible. We'll talk about 4-bay bank barns. Another such scene, dirt road, chickens in the yard, another 4-bay bank barn. The agriculture of the day is animal powered. There are some mechanized enhancements, but this is pre-tractor days. And with the plowman has a tie on. Another farm scene in Shenandoah County with a 4-bay bank barn. I know it's a 4-bay bank barn because here it is today. Same barn still standing. Orchards and fruit growing became popular or also widespread in Shenandoah County in the early part of the 20th century. So here's a scene showing the large expanse of orchards. It was a very labor-intensive type of agriculture at the time. The apple pickers, no machines, everything done by hand, and a place where women could be employed. Here is a peach orchard center as well. A cornfield, grain corn, always important in the county. This is maybe the neatest looking cornfield I've ever seen after the harvest. Poultry, also important, of course, horse-drawn vehicles. Swine, all, we're going to see that the ethnic settlers were very Germanic, so pork is an important part of farming. Everybody had a milk cow, more than one, often 2 or 3 small dairies. Beef cattle also were part of the agricultural scene in the early part of the 20th century. But as I said, everything is animal powered. I believe this is a manure spreader. It's a machine, a mechanical device, but still drawn by horses. And it looks to me like the wagon has just been, the team has just been unhitched from the wagon in the barn. That wagon, the team is interesting, but the wagon is stuffed full of hay in the central bay of the barn behind the subjects of the photograph. A proud farmer showing off his horses. Those horses look pretty fancy to me. I suspect they pulled buggies. The draft animals seem to be a little more robust usually. Also a cornfield behind our farmer friend in this view. When the wheat is ripe in the field, they bring a binder out, horse-drawn. This mechanical device cuts the wheat. On the left side of the binder, creates the sheaves which fall off the right side into the field. Here's a scene on one of the largest spreads in the county. 4 binders at work at the same time. You can see the wheat sheaves piled up. There's a certain pattern to that, a little more visible in this view. They're stacked a certain way so they shed water if it rains. They stay in the field, I'm told, about 3 or 4 weeks until the crop is dry enough for the grain to be easily separated from the stalk. And if you had been in Shenandoah County during harvest time in 1915, you would have seen this sort of scene all over the county. But eventually the wheat is gathered up in the big wagons. Here you can see they load it to the gills to bring it to the barn for threshing. Here is the threshing team that goes around barn to barn to thresh the crops. What you're seeing is a steam-powered tractor. The horses are not hitched to it. It's drawing the threshing machine behind it, and that machine will be set up in the barn. And I think this is the big leather belt you'll see in a moment. Because barns and threshed wheat are pretty combustible, the steam-powered wood-fired tractor has to be a considerable distance from the barn. And here it is, set out from the barn. You can see the long leather belt that drives the thresher inside the barn. The team, neighbors have come to help the farmer with the threshing chore. They're going to stay all day, but they'll go home at 4 o'clock because they have their own farm chores to do, and come back the next day if they don't finish. Sometimes it's a much smaller operation. I think this is a very early 1-cylinder threshing motor with a belt and a small ground barn. And by the way, Shenandoah County, some of the farms are quite small, so something at this scale is not at all surprising. On a large scale, when the threshing is done, the pile of straw ejected out of the barn can be almost as big as the barn. And this barn's located in one of the more fertile parts of the county, so it's not a surprise that the harvest is a large one. Okay, let's talk about barns. I use the term historic barns, and I have a specific meaning for that. Historic means local design, materials, and construction. And that goes to about 1950, when more modern buildings are starting to be erected. And to really be a barn, I think it needs to do 3 functions: hay or fodder storage, animal stalls, and crop processing and storage. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Survey I've been conducting started in 2017. I've looked at 270 barns. I think historic barns, I think that's in the realm of half of what's in the county today. I collect certain data, as you see here, for each barn. I go to each barn. I've been to each one myself, been in every one of them. And I have a team of 2 or 3 dedicated helpers that come with me on occasion. I can survey a barn in about 20 minutes if there's no conversation, but usually there's conversation. And the barn owners are always gracious and given access to their barns. It's one of the joys of this chore or task, to meet people all across the county and to hear what they're thinking about and to see their barns, which they almost universally really care for. Let's look just briefly at what you see in Shenandoah County in terms of barns. There's really 4 sort of types, if you will: 2 forms: ground barn and bank barn. And then there's 2 kinds of construction of historic barns: log and timber frame. You see the percentages here from my survey. So most of the barns surviving today are timber frame. The form is mostly bank barn, and therefore the timber frame bank barn dominates what we see in Shenandoah County today. So let's talk briefly about that. Many of you know this quite well, but others may not. Here's a 4-bay bank barn. It has 2 levels, one below, hay storage and grain processing above. The key feature is a ramp on the back side that allows wagons and vehicles to enter at the level of the first floor, and an overhanging projection called a 4-bay, which protects the animal stall entry area from mud, etc. That 4-bay is like a DNA signature in Shenandoah County barns. It comes from Pennsylvania because the people who settled here came from Pennsylvania, and those people came from the Germanic areas of Switzerland and the Upper Rhine River. There's been a lot of research about the origin of the 4-bay, and folks have gone to Switzerland to find those, and they are there in the 15 and 1600s, and they bring that to America, to Pennsylvania, and then migrate to the Shenandoah Valley area. And here's a map depicting that. I plagiarized this from the Pennsylvania Barn, the Bible of the Pennsylvania Barn by Robert Ensminger. You see here the area where the densest concentration of this type of barn exists. Red Star, of course, is Shenandoah County. As settlers moved west, some of them brought them with them, but the density of 4-bay or Pennsylvania barns decreases as the further west you go. But here in the Shenandoah Valley, it's the dominant barn form. Take a quick look at log barns, just say a little bit about them. They're typically in my county, they have 2 cribs. And you can see the 2 cribs here, and I'll show you what that means in a minute. I decided one day I would build a log barn, and so I did. You see 2 cribs, you add an alley or an arcade to one side, you put a wooden roof over it, and you have a 2-crib log ground barn. Only in this case, I think it's properly called a 2-crib log dining room table barn. The other construction form, of course, is timber frame, as I mentioned earlier. Here you see some of the framing inside such a barn. These framing elements are called bents, B-E-N-T, and they are joined with mortise and tenon joinery pegged together. Here we see a wooden peg inserted. This has a tab on it called a tenon. This element has a slot the tab goes into. The slot is called a mortise. And maybe a little plainer view of it is one that's come apart in one of the barns I surveyed. You see the mortise, the tenon, the holes that will align once the down brace is properly placed into the I-beam, and it'll be pegged together. To construct such a barn, the foundation and the first floor are built by a master builder, but then the whole community gathers together and builds the bents on the day of the barn raising. If you've seen the movie Witness, there's a pretty Hollywood version of that, but it has some good elements in it. Here we see a picture. This one's not Shenandoah County. I believe it's probably Amish country, likely Pennsylvania, but possibly somewhere else. The bent is being raised. One has already been erected. The second one is going up with these pike poles. If you look closely, you can see the next ones are already assembled on the floor of the barn, ready to go up after the second bent is in place. This activity goes on all day long. They get all the bents erected in one day. It was done that way in Shenandoah County as well. I don't have a picture quite as vivid as the previous one, but here we see an actual photo of a Shenandoah County barn raising in 1938 with a lot of people at work helping. And the quote at the bottom of this is from the man whose barn it was. He was 103 years old when I interviewed him, and he told me nobody got paid. They'd all help each other, and it was their turn to raise a barn. They got the help for free. But they did have one element of the barn raising that they really enjoyed, and there was always a big feast, not really after, but in the middle of the day, dinner, but really lunch. And this is the dinner scene from the same barn raising as the previous picture. Recently, our local archivist found a couple of articles in newspapers from the 20s, and sent them to me. And it's interesting to see the numbers of people, 38 plus 18 others in one case, 25 plus 7 or 8 others in another. And both articles mentioned that dinner prominently. So it was a real community effort, and something that just doesn't happen anymore quite the same way. Okay, now barns. We're going to go through a lot of barns, and each one I'm going to go fairly quickly, but each one you'll probably see a date. And I'll just say a little about that right now. So, C means circa, about. If you see a question mark after it, that means I'm really doubtful. Circa means give or take 10 years. And the more I learn about barns, the less certain I am about dating them. There's lots of clues in a barn: tool marks, hardware, form, foundation, materials, sometimes oral history, rarely recorded history, pitch of the roof. I mean, there are just many, many things that will help you guess at a barn's construction date. But since they've been owned by 4 or 5 generations, sometimes even more, the exact dates get pretty blurry. And so take all of those with a grain of salt, but over time.
I have the whole thing here tonight.
Isn't that the truth, though? I will say it's a very good thing to point out that we often get questions about dating barns that are it's case by case. It's always so hard to do. John, we had thought there's a little bit of a lag in the video versus your communication. If you were to turn off your video screen, I am told you can still share the screen, and that might help things go more smoothly. There are occasionally little technological snags, but if you wanted to give that
okay, let me see. I think this is how I do that.
There you go. See if that helps. Go ahead. Sorry.
I put on my glasses, make sure. Start video, rename. No, that didn't seem to make any difference.
All right. Well, we will live with it. It's not a major flaw by any means. It's just occasionally it's a little slow to catch up on the slide by the time you get there. But you know, these things are a part of Zoom fun. We're all there.
Okay, I think I turned it off, but we'll see. I'll try to go a little more. We'll just keep going. Okay, we talked about dates and how shaky they can be, and or difficult. Let's just say it that way. You might not think this is a log barn, but of course the barn people who are quite knowledgeable will instantly see the asymmetrical roof line, and they'll recognize something pretty old is under this thing. And if you were to go inside this particular barn, you would find log crib of the Shenandoah County Historical Society. This barn, we'll talk just a moment about this one, a 2-crib log barn with exposed logs, so easy to see. We had a survey of this property performed in 1786, and we believed this was the barn that was surveyed at that time. But just recently, we completed dendroarchaeology on this barn, tree ring science, and 20-some samples of the logs, which are mostly white oak, revealed that these logs were felled in 1840 and 1841. So the barn can't be the one that was surveyed in 1786, but a subsequent barn built on the same property. And this is very revealing. Important to note that barns using this construction technology are constructed in our county as late as the 1840s, which was a bit of a surprise to me, but now we know. Interior of the barn showing one of the corners of one of the cribs, V-notch joinery, which is almost always what you find in Shenandoah County for any log building, rarely something else. A 2-crib log ground barn. Notice the cribs are asymmetrical in terms of size, one larger than the other. These log barns typically have a pretty big overhang. That seems to be a feature locally. And here you can see it more readily on a different 2-crib log ground barn. The overhang's been reinforced and repaired, but the barn is an ancient one, so you would expect some of that. And inside you can clearly see 2 cribs in the ground, literally ground floor. A similar barn, but a bit more sophisticated, has a better stone foundation, and the contour of the ground allows the portion on the left side of the barn to be a bit taller, which creates enough space to have animal stalls underneath, a floor, and a haymow above. On the right side, you can see the opening into the haymow. It's similar over there. This form shows up a couple of times in Shenandoah County. Here's another barn quite similar, but not the same barn. And it obviously has condition problems, but here you can see the animal stall side and the haymow above. We go in that barn, whoops, go back. We see the V-notch joinery. Notice one of the key logs in this crib is fractured, suggesting settling. And indeed, I came back 2 years later and found this. So with no maintenance or care get provided to it, eventually a barn will collapse. Transitioning from log to timber frame, there's a couple of barns. I don't know if this is really an evolution or just a moment, but a barn that has both, that is log crib and timber frame. When I enter this barn, on the right side is a typical log crib as part of the structure, but if standing in the same spot, if I turn to the left, I see timber framing. And the purlins, the plate in this barn are continuous, which suggests to me, unless the entire roof was replaced, that the barn was built this way. Here's a similar barn, but this one I know was built in 2 sessions because the timber frame side over on the left has circular saw marks. And the barn is a little asymmetrical. This little gable feature is not in the middle. I think it was a single crib 4-bay barn and when you go around to the ramp side, you see that the sliding doors are off center. So I think this barn was built in a early 18th and a later 18th or even 1900 time frame. This is interior of the barn showing the log, part of the log crib on that side. Now we transition to timber frame barns, and we start with this one. I'm trying to put these in what I believe are sort of chronological order, the timber frame barns. This one we did dendro archaeology on recently and got a confusing answer, which folks tell me is not always, isn't that exceptional with dendro analysis. The barn has timbers from felled in both 1810 and 1867, and about half and half. And they're mixed all throughout the barn. It's not like the left half is early and the right half is later. So my my working theory is a barn was built here about 1811 on a stone foundation. By the 1860s, it was in such disrepair that they needed to rebuild the entire barn, and they reused materials from the original barn where and if they could. Another very 4-bay bank barn. You see posts on a lot of these, but the posts are added later. And we know this because there's no sill under the 4-bay. It was just hanging out in space, sometimes 8 feet or so. But that starts to sag over time, and often posts are added later. I knew this was an old barn because inside the floorboards are 2-inch thick oak, grooved, not tongue and grooved, but only grooved, with a spline between the grooves of adjacent boards and fastened to the joists below with wooden pegs. In Shenandoah County, I believe that to be a pretty good signature of an early barn. Another early 4-bay bank barn. This one had some fun inside. I failed to mention when we looked at the diagram of a 4-bay bank barn that often there's a granary, a small room in one corner that's tongue and groove boards to try to keep the vermin out. And I learned after surveying several barns that you should look closely in the granary. There's often graffiti, pencil graffiti or other, on the wall. And here we see June 20th, 1929, threshing 312 bushels of barley. So I think if somebody were to survey all the barns in Shenandoah County and record the graffiti, you could get a sense of how big the crops were, when they harvested, what kinds of grains, etc. Always worth looking at that, and often signed, and typically many, many stroke marks. Each bushel they count, and they put a stroke mark on the wall. Another great 4-bay bank barn with an 8-foot 4-bay hanging out in space. And if you're a structural engineer, you may wonder, how do those things survive that long? The floor joists in this case appear to be white oak. Summer beam you can see in the background, and the sill in the foreground, also white oak, which in my observations is the most endures better than other species of wood, especially pine. Barn with multiple additions and sheds added, etc. But this one was kind of interesting because when we go to the 4-bay side and look up, we see that the floor joists are composed of logs being reused from some other building. Here's the notch for a V-notch. Obviously, you don't do that just for a floor joist. So they tore something down and used the logs for the new barn whenever it was built. This one has added posts. Again, no sill under the 4-bay, and those posts are all resting on concrete, which tells me that's a later modification of the barn. Shenandoah County barns often have a 1-foot overhang on the gable end and on the ramp side. If you look for that on other barns, you'll see it. Of course, the 4-bay may be 6 or 4, 6 or 8 feet wide, but we also see overhang on the other 3 sides with some frequency. I'm just going to kind of go through these. Here's the one with an 11-foot unposted 4-bay. That's the record that I've found so far in Shenandoah County. Now, you might wonder if all the barns are red, but no, not every barn is. Although I expect this one was at one time, but now covered in metal. Go inside this one on the upper level and look up, and you see a pretty confusing interior structure. The vents have been reinforced and added to, and there seems to be some replacement in all of that. I think if I had started all over, I might have been able to tell who built which barn by how the vents were constructed. But this one, I just was beyond me. This barn also has stone columns supporting the summer beams, a feature not usually found in Shenandoah County. They're almost always just wooden posts. This barn is as wide as it is long, which is very unusual. We see overhang on all sides, but no real forebay. In the foreground of this barn is the site of the barn, the one pictured, replaced. The one that was in the foreground was burned during the Civil War, and this one was constructed immediately after. A more typical form of the vents inside that barn. And another red 4-bay bank barn, another red 4-bay bank barn, another red 4-bay bank barn. This is a big one, still heavily used for agriculture. Great tall ceiling, angled posts as part of the vent structure. A much smaller red 4-bay bank barn. This one has a shed on the bank side, something I think happens frequently in barns in other areas, but very rare. I don't know, I've seen another one like this in Shenandoah County. The sheds are almost always added on the 4-bay side locally, or on the ends, the gable ends. Here's a pretty little white paint barn, posted 4-bay bank barn, unposted 4-bay bank barn, posted 4-bay bank barn. By the way, 2/3 of the at least 2/3 of the 4-bay bank barns were unposted as constructed, I believe. This barn is typical of a barn that's had many, many modifications, extensions, sheds added, modernizations, etc. So you have to go inside to see what's there. And again, the graffiti in this one was really fun. The kids found the dad's scale. I guess he was weighing feet or something, and they weighed each other. July 28th, 1903. Mm-hmm. Francis, Dorothy, Geraldine, Billy, and Gerald. If you, I don't know if you can see this on your screens, but there are a lot of stroke marks also on the graffiti wall in this barn. And on we go, more and more. 8-foot unposted 4-bay. This is so typical of Shenandoah County. This barn was fun. The owner's great-great-grandfather built it in 1898. The poor barn is about to collapse, I fear. It was a windy day. I went inside and the barn was literally shaking and talking. It was a memorable moment. And I fear that barn is not standing today. Keep going, looking at some more, moving through time a little bit, up to about 1900, but you see they haven't really changed much. Here's a barn where the granary is quite visible. The last barn, as I moved, this room, if you will, in one corner has bins in it to allow the farmer to store the grain as he's threshing it. And we see more this County. The next barn is not this barn, but a different barn. And I'll point out, I know Greg Huber points out the decorations on barns in his area frequently. This barn is one of the few with any decorative thing applied to it. And it's nothing but a simple plain white circle. The local standard is we don't decorate our barns, apparently. They're very utilitarian, although I believe they're beautiful in their way. And by the way, this little door that seems to be hanging in space is into the granary. So a wagon, or nowadays a pickup truck, can pull up under that door and the grain can be loaded directly out of the granary. Underneath this barn, we see a sort of chute system where in the floor above, the fodder can be poured into chutes. It falls, gravity brings it to this bin, and it's still being used that way. One of the advantages of a two-level barn, of course, is using gravity. And I'm going to comment about metal coverings. I know if you read the Secretary's standards, they don't really like that. They say paint your barn, don't cover it in metal, but I have a slightly different view. If that's what it takes to preserve your barn, then by all means do that. I think it's very effective. And frankly, if you ever wanted to, a subsequent person could take the metal off and go back to the wooden siding. This one, this last barn still has the hay fork, which you find almost universally in Shenandoah County barns. There's a single metal track and the fork can be moved the length of the barn. Of course, it drops down to grab the hay out of the wagon and bring it over to the mow. And I talked to several old timers who remember using the horse and the rope system to fill the hay mows in the barn using the hay fork. And if you don't think we have read Shenandoah County, you have been sleeping. But here's a white one. Here it is when it was built, about the time it was built in 1919. This barn is the straightest, neatest. All, of course, the joists are all milled, floor joists. The summer beam is straight and true. It's all white oak and still being used really heavily for agriculture as it was intended when it was first built 100 years ago. Sometimes the forebay is not quite so wide. When you get to 1920, the foundations change over from limestone or other stone to more typically to poured concrete. But otherwise, the architecture of the barns is little changed from 100 years earlier. And we see into the 1920s. Mama cow had a calf inside this barn and she wasn't sure. She wanted me in there to take photographs, but we reached an agreement and I was able to do it. Another unposted 4-bay bank barn. 1947, gambrel roof, but still an unposted 4-bay bank barn in Shenandoah County. And the last one chronologically, 1950, built at the county Poor Farm. And in this case, the construction used what was then modern technology, machines, and there are not nearly as many people constructing it. And in a way, that to me sort of signifies the end of the historic barn. But when we think about all of these timber frame barns, my goodness, where did all the wood come from? Fortunately, Shenandoah County is heavily forested, especially at the bottoms of the mountains. Here's an old time sawmill, and that same map from 1885 also designated the sawmills. And here we see 41 sawmills noted in 1885. A quick look at some ground barns. They do exist in Shenandoah County. They're not nearly as numerous. And at first glance, it looks like you're looking at a bank on a 4-bay bank barn, but on this one, when you walk around to the other side, you see it's on the ground. There is no 4-bay. And we have several examples of this. In this one, we can see the center of It has a floor where threshing could be done, and the other bays have space for stalls below and haymows above. And if you look inside, you see how that is configured. I'm standing on the threshing floor. On the left, the stalls below and the haymows above in a ground barn. Last ground barn, nice little ground barn with a brand new roof, belongs to your program presenter. A few statistics you see here, 270 barns, only 20 are log or part log. 70% of all barns surveyed. And you see the average are bank barns. You see the average sizes. Obviously, the timber frame bank barns are a little bigger than the others. Less than half of them are in agricultural use. That's a judgment I make when I survey them. A lot of them have equipment storage, but no active agriculture. I judge the condition on a simple scale using my own judgment. You see 1 is good, 4 is dangerous to enter. And it looks like these are in pretty good shape, but I think it's a biased sample because the barns that come to me for surveying tend to be the ones whose owners have been taking care of them and want me to come out and record them. A few unusual barns don't really fit the pattern in Shenandoah County. This one actually has a ground floor on 2 levels. The hill behind it is very steep. This one at first looks pretty typical. However, if it didn't take long to notice that the bank is on the gable end. And frankly, I've never seen another one of this scale in Shenandoah County with a gable end bank. So this is a real oddball. I have not surveyed this barn, just photographed it. Brick, unique in Shenandoah County. Well, there's another one that's been converted into a residence, but it's just exception in our county, not maybe in other parts of the country. I have to show this one. A rich Englishman comes to Shenandoah County in the 1890 time frame and decides to, it's not really a barn, it's a stable, but it's the longest. It's 160 feet long. It's just crazy big. It's just so out of place locally. Here's the central bay, the stables on each side. And if you count those framing elements above as vents, it has 16. The stable side on one side has been converted into event space. Amazing, amazing structure. Another unusual barn, unusual because it's a ground barn with a gable end entry. This barn is a 4-bay bank barn, but what's unusual about it is the framing inside is not sawn or hewn timbers, but rather skinned trees, and not mortised and tenoned, but nailed. It's just, again, this is unique in Shenandoah County. I've never seen another one, anything like it. Underneath that barn, it's similar. The floor joists are these massive logs. I believe you could drive a tank into this barn. Notice it's got a forked tree as one of its posts for this. This is really the sill. This is the end of the 4-bay as it was originally constructed, and a shed added later. Here's a ground barn that has a 4-bay. That sounds a little confusing, but inside the only access to the 4-bay is via a ladder. There's no floor at the level of the 4-bay. I don't really need to tell you why I think this one is unusual, I hope. So I'll close with a couple of thoughts. These are kind of sad, but this is what happens when things aren't being used. Maintenance of a frame structure that's of no use is not something everybody can afford. And the result is failing structures and loss. As you see, This would be a dangerous to enter barn. I did not go in this one. Another such. Failure of the foundation wall under the ramp, right where the ramp enters the upper level. This is a vulnerable spot in barns, and I often find that they've been reinforced, repaired, or that's where they get wet and eventually fail. And these are kind of grim pictures, and I can't end on such a note. So I won't. I will do a few before and after. All of the next 4 barns, the pictures when I first surveyed it and the before picture, and something good has happened to that barn in the meantime. So here's the after picture. Before. This barn had had a fair amount of work done on it, but the owner was determined to make it even more durable. So after. This is the one with the skin pole framing. It was in really difficult condition. Here it is, cleaned up, ready for the next 100 years. This is a great barn. It's a gable on hip roof. Very unusual. I don't have a good picture for that to be apparent, but you see foundation, structural foundation problems, a lot of difficulties with this barn. Here's the after picture. This barn was neat for a lot of things. You can see it's an unboosted 4-bay barn, and now it has posts. The owner told me you could hear it groaning when they jacked it back up to put the posts in. And I just have to say, I can't imagine Shenandoah County without scenes like this in it. It's just hard to characterize what such a vista adds, the barn adds to such a view. It just wouldn't be the same without these barns. So I've reached the end, and I'm happy to take questions, or if anybody's put anything in the chat, I haven't really been noticing, but I will leave this screen up for just a moment. If anybody wants more, there's some ways to get it from our Shenandoah County Historical Society website. I have created a Google map accessible through that website with every barn I have surveyed designated by a pin on the map. And if you click on that pin, you will see a picture of the barn and a brief description of the barn and my initial estimate of its construction date. So, what's
Thank
next?
you, John. No, thank you. And I'm so glad you mentioned your map, because I certainly had that here on my list to bring up. I think that's an incredibly helpful feature that you've put together. And I think it also highlights the way that, I mean, I would like, maybe perhaps I can even start a question there. To create such a map and to provide that documentation, is that still free through Google Earth? Can you create a map layer like that at no cost?
It's not Google Earth, Danae, it's Google Maps.
Okay.
And it is free. It took me a little, I'm not the most adept computer jockey, but there are lots of YouTube videos on how to do that. It's not terribly difficult. It's a little clunky, but it's a great way to document and kind of the dispersal of anything, in this case, barns.
Right. And I think making that accessible is tremendous, because of course, as you brought up with your stats, and I know I had to, my heart just melted because I think context is everything. Local context is everything. And I know before John started this survey, we had a lot of discussions, and John took the time to meet with a lot of different people and gather a lot of input on the methods and the methodology that he would ultimately, craft. But I will say, from an architectural historian's viewpoint, but also, I think from really helping support barn preservation at a local grassroots effort, which we really hope is, is the main goal, is the big big win. This type of county-based, county-level data is really incredible, and clearly you've found some real gems in all of that work. I think if there were questions that I would bring up that we could discuss, there was a really great comment brought up about some of the stone foundation, the location for where those things might have been, if the stone might have been pulled from. I think there were some other questions about, well, I noted the stuff about the sawmills as well, that you had said there were 40 plus sawmills, and I can't remember the date from that particular garnishing of data, but I wanted to let other people know. I've been in Virginia now for a little while. I come from Kentucky originally. Kentucky has 120 counties. We're only second behind the state of Texas. Virginia is the third at 106 counties. So to have those 40 sawmills, you should also understand that our counties are fairly small here. And so that's a lot of sawmills for a relatively geographically confined area. So so is there anything else that you could tell us, maybe what your survey has highlighted about local materials, local resources, and the investment that shows in their barns that way?
Yeah, okay. The geology of Shenandoah County is karst, limestone, lots of springs, a lot of underground streams, limestone outcroppings abound. There are numerous and still active, commercially active limestone quarries. So the foundations of Shenandoah County barns are typically limestone. As you get close to the mountains, you find more sandstone, but dominated by limestone. And it's ashlar. It fractures in fairly straight lines. Some of the foundations are really well done, but unlike barns I've seen in parts of Pennsylvania, you don't find entire stone barns or gable end walls that are all the way to the eave or even to the peak made of stone. It's just, they just didn't do that here. I think we're sort of the poor country cousins, some of those fancy Pennsylvania barns. You said something about sawmills. Most of those 41 that were depicted on that 1885 map, and maybe even every one of them, I was sick one weekend and looked hard at that map, are on streams. Sash saw marks, water-powered sash saws were, the technology of choice for a long time. I don't think we find circular saw marks on timbers in Shenandoah County before the Civil War, and maybe not for a few years afterwards. We see these perfectly straight parallel sash saw marks on a lot of sawn timbers in the timber frame barns of Shenandoah County, and the floorboards, et cetera.
Excellent. Pertaining to another question about materials, Vera had a very good question. If you were able to identify any of the woods in those silos, I definitely saw a number of wood stave silos, which I will say in my surveys, they're increasingly rare, exceedingly rare. Any details that you had to share about those?
I'm going to admit that silos have been secondary to me. They typically are added. My survey, I didn't mention this, but I try to survey the barn as built. I want to see what was being constructed at the time it was being constructed. And so unfortunately, by the time I was tuned into silos, I was 150 barns down the road. And they're not terribly common. They sort of come and go. You see a lot of silo bases, stone or concrete where the silo's been removed. But in terms of wood species, a lot of pine in the timber frame barns, the older barns, the log barns. It seems that oak is a bit more common, although there's some pine as well. And indeed, there's oak, mostly white, but also red oak in the timber frame barns. But I would say far less than half of the barns. I learned from the dendroarchaeologist that I wasn't really that good at identifying wood species at first. I was seeing the dark oxidation of white oak and believing it to be walnut for a while. And then she pointed out, no, oak has rays and walnut doesn't, and so forth. And if you can see the ends of the timbers or the logs, you can tell quickly. But but at the same time, there is some walnut used at times in barn construction. Walnut trees grow pretty frequently in Shenandoah County, and so they've been used for structure as well. But yellow pine, followed by 2 species of oak, at least 2 species, and then some walnut and some chestnut.
Nice. Yeah, I will say, I know Michael Spencer, who teaches here at the University of Mary Washington, my husband, for those who don't know, but anyway, has said that he often, it takes a slide. It actually takes getting a sample in there and really careful investigation. So I will give you praise for even attempting wood identification, because that is not in my wheelhouse of skill sets just yet. So, but it's funny you said I did have a similar question randomly in another engagement about hollow tile silos. So I mean, I think there are various materials, you're right, and certainly different features. A barn and a farm in general is so complex, and of course, for those of us who really investigate them thoroughly, I call them patchwork quilts. They come together from so many different periods, from so many different evolutions. So I think it's just important to document what you can, no matter what, and even just through photographs, they capture one moment in time where you're right, that barn might not be there next month. So so just documenting it, which of course is one of the bigger things that the Barn Alliance has been pushing on for a while, is really worth it, and an incredible investment of time and effort. So for that, we are certainly thankful. And like I said, I think all the stories that you keep contributing to the barn door are amazing too, that you let other people see how much can be gleaned. I'll use a pun there for the farmers, from a survey, and how far you can take it. I didn't really see, I'm trying to make sure I've covered other questions. If anybody else has some, I think there was a moment, there's some discussion about different materials and how to care for barns as we try to preserve them best we can. Let's see, I think Greg Huber did ask about purlin post barns and how many there are in the county. Is that something that you can speak to?
Purlin, post to purlin. In other words, the major post of the bent connects vertically to the purlin, which is a mid-span longitudinal timber in the roof structure. It's common in Shenandoah County, but honestly, it's not a particular a feature that I specify in my survey data. I would say it's in at least half of the timber frame barns are done that way. Although later barns tend to have that canted element to make a wider space for hay handling, if people who know what I'm talking about. So older barns, post to purlin, quite common. Newer barns, less so. But really quite common in Shenandoah County. It's interesting, no two barns are the same, no matter what you think when you saw all the pictures I showed of those red 4-bay, unposted 4-bay bank barns. They always have different features of some sort or other, certainly the stall arrangements, even the size of the barn, what corner the granary is in, if it has a granary. Most do, but at one time I thought, well, they'll all be in the same corner, but they're not. They're in the northwest, the southeast, and the facing of the barn.
Right.
You would expect the 4-bay to be away from the bad weather. That's the preferred orientation, I think, of a barn in Shenandoah County. The bad weather comes from the west, so we see the 4-bay facing east most commonly. Because the county sort of slants northeast to southwest. When I say east, it's actually slightly south of east, but occasionally you see the 4-bay facing south, and at other times the wrong way. I mean, I've seen them facing west and north. The lay of the land sometimes dictates that. The natural hillside, so they just built it the way it was, or maybe that spot had a microclimate that wasn't so bad. Or maybe, the barn builders knew which way to face it. That was something
Right.
they thought about when they built the barn.
Yes, you're exactly right. I do think there's a lot in there. There's another question that came about the direction of siding, horizontal versus vertical. I noticed a lot in your picture, at least where it looked like original weatherboard was there, was horizontal siding.
Yes, indeed. And I was reading in a barn book, and this author said, well, after the Civil War, because all the barns were burned in Shenandoah County during the Civil War, and after the Civil War, when they rebuilt them, they didn't have any barn builders, so they used house carpenters who were used to horizontal siding. That's BS. That can't be right. I'm sorry. I know it wasn't Greg Huber. He's smarter than that, but it was just local custom. And all the barns weren't not burned during the Civil War. Yes, indeed, many were, hundreds in fact, but there are survivors that are clearly pre-Civil War barns. The burning, systematic destruction of barns in Shenandoah County during the Civil War only lasted during 2 days. There were other times when barns were burned during the war, of course, for other reasons, but the systematic burning only took place on October 7th and October 8th, 1864. They could not burn 2,000 barns in 2 days.
John, can I jump in here for a second?
Yes,
Sure.
please, Chuck.
So for those who don't know me, I'm Chuck Boltman. I'm on the board and I'm an architect. And with respect to the horizontal and vertical siding, there is another consideration. The pragmatic part of it is timber frame barns tend to, with the bent construction that are spaced out maybe 14 or 16 feet, then there's a series of horizontals that go between those bents. Therefore, you're going to vertically side it because otherwise you have nothing to nail to. There are barns that have horizontal siding. They have to be studded out vertically behind it. So all of the building materials are constantly being turned perpendicular to one another as you layer them on. So timber framing 75% of the time or more ends up being vertically sided because it's most of the framing members end up being horizontal. So it's an effort to get to a horizontally sided timber frame.
Thanks, Chuck. That's I'm sure you're correct about that. And indeed, when I go in the barns, you see so much horizontal siding in Shenandoah County, but in effect, they've put studs in for that purpose. So you see 2x4s that aren't really structural, but really act more as nailers for the horizontal siding.
Exactly.
My guess is it's local custom, but maybe horizontal siding sheds rain a little better than vertical. I'm not sure, but my observation is that in this German DNA barn building county, you don't change the norms very often. You could see that the barns for 100 years look so similar. It's just remarkable. So I think custom and has a lot to do with choices like that.
I concur. I'd also heard that the weather consideration as well. I will also say it seems to me that it takes fewer boards to side a barn if you go vertical. I think with horizontal, but you're right. If you have a sawmill locally that's chucking out side, whether we're siding, no problem. It definitely, I think, is something subject to local custom. I think that's a very good way of.
And you're absolutely right. There's more framing members to end up with a horizontally sided building.
To complicate the situation a little bit, there are actually a number of barns in New York State that have both vertical siding and horizontal siding. And there was a Dutch barn in central New Jersey in Somerset County that actually had shakes up to a certain point, and then it had other siding above that. I think it was horizontal siding. So I think John, the major statement that's been made about this is that it's local custom. You know, I really believe that. I think people get really caught up in all kinds of theories and this and that and the other thing, and it's local custom. That's the way they did it, and they didn't want to put themselves out too much to make themselves look, I'm better than you. And I think there's a good deal of truth to that. When you said this one guy came in and built a 160-foot long barn or something like that, you know, he wasn't local, and he came in and he did what he did. Is that right?
Yes, yes, he was wealthy and flamboyant, and
Yeah.
I know that the carpenters that helped him build that talked amongst themselves. They must have had a time.
And I think, Henry Glassy also had a thing for that. Is why did they do it that way? Because that's the way it was done. Anchor beam tenons in Dutch American barns get shorter and shorter as the years went by. So about 1800 to 1820 or so, and there are exceptions to this, they got, on average, they got shorter and shorter. Now, why? And some of those timbered barns are very large, so they didn't need the support. As they say, there was a barn in Schoharie County, New York, that had 24-inch anchor beams, and the tenons extended all of an inch or two or something. So, you know, I think the idea of custom is extremely important.
And we
And
find in Shenandoah County, at least in the early 20th century, we find the name of a couple of master builders over and over. So my thought is that's how that guy built the barn. And if you wanted Mr. Weatherholtz to build a barn, he built it the way he was used to.
So I think the gradualism with the customs, you know, if you gradually did things in a certain way, the sidewalls got higher as the years went on, and the roof got less steep and all that kind of thing. You know, you didn't have that much innovation. But the interesting thing about the earliest barns that I'm aware of in North America are in the mid-Hudson River Valley, and there's still 18 barns that are pre-revolutionary in all likelihood. 3 of them are dated, two are 1766 and another is 1750. And after the Revolutionary War, there was a dramatic change, and they didn't make major minor rafter systems and all that. So there was a major disruption of labor power, and I think materials on a certain level.
And I definitely just want to follow up and to say that those particularities of local custom are what is the best information that is gathered from the types of surveys that really do pay attention to the details. And I know they take a lot of time and effort and sincere commitment. And I could testify from working with John for and watching how carefully he crafted all this together. But how long it takes and how much that John, you very politely and very carefully, but I think had mentioned how much you enjoyed the discussions and the things that happen. I do think that's a part of that commitment. Once you make it, to really engage in historic barns at that localized level, and it's really an invaluable tool for preservationists, but also I think anyone, you know, for county historical societies, anyone who wants to advocate for historic barns. Documentation at the county level is really where it's at and where you can begin to build a base of understanding. So I will again, I'll thank John from the bottom of my heart for all of that, because Virginia has certainly benefited from all the work that he has done, and I hope that all of the work you do and it connects well with Pennsylvania, as Greg Huber being there and other friends in that region. We can really look at how these things evolve from different places based on a variety of influences. So I didn't see, I hope I haven't missed anything question wise, but like I said, we're always available. You can certainly send any further inquiries to info@Barn Alliance, and I can pass them along to John, and we will post the lecture on our YouTube page and hopefully keep the conversation going. And we really appreciate everyone who took the time to come and attend tonight's lecture. And again, many thanks to John for carefully crafting the conversation and welcoming me us all to enjoy the work that he has so diligently dedicated himself to for a couple years now, right?
Well, thanks, everybody. I enjoyed it. And I'm always ready to talk about barns. Just ask my wife.
Thank you, Barbara. You're part of this too. I know it. All right. Well, good night, friends. I hope you'll join us for the next one. And everybody stay safe, stay healthy.